It can happen at a hospital with an unexplained illness, or if your child says something that raises a red flag at school.
We don't need a warrant. We're CPS. We don't need a warrant.
This is video posted online by a local mom investigated after her special needs son said at school she didn't feed him when she says she simply changed his diet. Would you know what to do? She told the CPS worker, an attorney told her to ask what the allegations were before deciding whether to let her in the house.
Who told her that?
The attorney.
I don't know. Don't call these attorneys because they don't know what they're talking about.
Technically, this woman doesn't have to let her in her home.
CPS is arrogant. The attorney does know what they're talking about. You do not have to let them into your home. Do they have a warrant? No, don't let them into your home. I wouldn't even speak to them. Remove your child from that school. Know your right as a parent.
Quote, the number of children taken into state custody each year will be the number sufficient to generate the federal fund claims necessary to balance the agency payroll. The net result is a system in which everyone stays employed only if the number of founded child abuse cases in children taken into state custody always increases and never decreases.
What you said is he did not specifically say to me, my mom caused those marks on my legs. Do you have any idea whether these injuries in these photos are the injuries that you saw?
I do not.
So you lied?
I did not lie.
The Department of Children and Family investigators falsifying records.
Alleged falsification of these official records.
The DCF caseworker faces charges of falsifying records.
So when you testified before, you testified at least inaccurately.
Yeah, I have no intention of lying under oath.
But it wasn't accurate then. You don't stand by the statement that you made under oath.
Every person who's worked for DCF at one point or another has changed a time, has backed up a time, has changed a fact.
He never spoke to the child, but on the report said he did.
He was fabricating everything.
142 cases Urban investigated last year. He lied on 75 of them.
I'm guilty of working for an agency that has thrown children in foster homes, that has kidnapped children and thrown them in foster homes, where they are 6 times more likely to die. I'm guilty of working for Child Protective Services.
DCF Secretary Mike Carroll repeatedly refused to speak on camera. The Palm Beach Post spoke to a dozen former and current investigators about what's not happening when it comes to protecting Florida's children.
But did I break the rules? Yeah, I broke the rules. Why did I do it? I did it because I wanted to keep my job.
Something a dozen other investigators told us as well.
I served in the Georgia State Senate. I'm talking about those children removed from their homes intentionally for profit.
In fact, our director would say regularly, we aren't the friend of the family, we're the friend of the court. It was all about money.
And there are times when my supervisor would be like, oh, they can deal with it on their own.
This is not to say that there are not those children who need to be removed. They are.
The United States took over children first through public education, but now they do it through the state ownership of children, because within the United States, the parent does not own the child. The state does.
Quote, hundreds of thousands of children face abuse every year, but there is only one federal law that directly addresses this national tragedy. That law, a review by the Globe and Pro Publica finds, is routinely and often flagrantly violated with consequences that should come as no surprise. Source: Globe Spotlight Fellows, December 13, 2019, by Emily Palmer and Jessica Boston.
Greetings, humans. My name is Robin, and I am Comrade Pasha's emotional regulation communicator. Occasionally, new facts and history are so inhumane, Posh is unable to process her emotions. When these incidents occur, you will be notified with this triggered meter, as well as the corresponding level of intensity. Level 1.
Well, that new information is incredibly disturbing.
Level 2.
Oh my fucking god, that's so fucking bad. Oh my fucking...
Level 3.
That can't be true. No, that can't be true, that can't be true, that can't be true, no.
Level 4.
Fucking calling crazy, get to America, I fucking hate you.
Level 5.
This is fine. I'm fine. We're fine. I'm fine. So after graduating high school, I ended up moving to Texas to live with my birth mom for a little bit. And I was able to get another version of the story. My birth mom told me that my adopted mom just showed up at her apartment one day and said that they could help her by taking me. That they would just take me and that would help my mom. Basically, they pitched it as, you know, giving an 18-year-old less responsibilities. Even though my mom was doing a fine job raising me. They ended up telling her that it was just, you know, I was just too much of a burden for my 18-year-old mother, so it would just be more responsible if I went and lived with my adopted. After that, I just decided for the next 15 years of my life that how I ended up with my adopted parents just didn't really matter, and I just made peace with the fact that I wasn't gonna know. Then about 2 months ago, I duetted a clip trying to share some information about CPS on TikTok. Just trying to spread awareness.
Taking somebody's kid after what they just went through.
Look at it.
Man, y'all really are the devil. Y'all really are devils. Y'all really fucking devils, man.
This is what they doing. This is what they doing to our community.
Yeah, no. Make sure you look at that. You fucking witch. Make sure you look at it. See what you're doing. This is what y'all been doing for centuries. Breaking up black families. This is what the fuck y'all do. You standing there watching the crime happen. Watching the crime.
I'm almost saying living back. One of y'all gets out
Then after reading through the comments for a couple of days, I kept noticing that the same comment kept reappearing. And it was people saying that yes, after CPS takes children from the home, they will charge that mother child support. And I was horrified. And these comments triggered me down memory lane of my own childhood, and I was able to ungaslight myself and figure out what actually happened. And what I realized was, while my adopted mother was struggling with in vitro unsuccessfully for a couple of years, she decided to call CPS on my 19-year-old black mother in a predominantly white city in order to remove me from my birth mother's home and to adopt me out themselves because it was cheaper. Much cheaper than private adoption agencies. Also, my parents practice a very cult-like version of evangelical Christianity, and so being a single mother is literally like a curse, like a generational curse. They thought literally my mom was, you know, living immorally. In sin. They like to call it living in sin. So after 34 years of not knowing exactly how I ended up with my adopted parents, and without either one of my mothers actually telling me the truth, I finally figured out how I ended up with my adopted parents. And yeah, that's why you guys got this video essay. Do you guys like my robe? I wanted to give you guys something aesthetically pleasing to look at while you listen to me tell stories about my childhood. It makes it easier to process.
I'm leaving with my baby. I'm leaving with my baby Cooper. I'm talking right here. This is what I'm talking. So look, what y'all want to talk about? What do y'all want to talk about?
The baby has to stay here.
The baby's not staying here. Look, let me tell you something. The baby does not have any drugs in his system. Does he? Does he? Does he?
Hold on.
Don't.
Never one time.
Look, you're gonna hurt my baby.
You let go.
You're gonna hurt my baby.
You let go.
Don't do that.
You let go.
Hey, Don't do that to me. Let go.
I got it on my head.
Let go of me. Please.
Who you are?
No,
Get the
no.
backpack.
You guys, I have not broke a law. You guys cannot do this to me. I know, but you guys are trying to take my baby. Please let go of me. Please.
I will cut the backpack if you don't let go of your arm.
No, please.
Let go of your arm. I'll cut it.
Please let go of me.
She's got a bag.
You guys, please let go of me. Yeah.
I got her, Cooper.
Oh my God.
I got it.
Please let go of me.
I can't see the cuff. Go ahead and get the other cuff, and then we can...
I can't breathe. I cannot breathe.
I got her, Cooper.
Oh my God.
I got it.
Please let go of me.
I can't see the cuff. Go ahead and get the other cuff, and then we can...
I can't breathe. I cannot breathe.
Let go of your hand or you're going to get resisting as well.
I have the bag on my head. That's why I can't let it go. What are you doing?
The hand I'm on. Got it.
Okay, now listen. Hold on. Wait. Listen. Where's my shoe at? Can I have it? You need to come talk to me because look what you just did. What are you trying to take my baby for? No, you did not try to. You don't know.
Talk to me. You kicked me out of the room.
Because I'm so upset. They kidnapped my baby.
Listen, can I
Please.
understand, ma'am, that you are...
You don't understand what's going on.
But you have to give me a chance to explain to you the situation that's going on.
But you know...
This way.
I don't want to go.
Here we go.
Where's my baby? Where's my baby? Where's my baby? Where's my baby?
Where are we going?
Why did you guys do that to me? Why are you going to nothing?
3 told me we're 10-4.
You guys need to bring my baby in here. Can you let me in?
Sit.
Don't talk to me.
Sit.
Don't talk to me like that. You know, do you like fat people? Don't talk to me like that. Mr. Church. Whatever your name is, I have not done nothing. I don't want you in my room. Can you get out?
No.
Mr. Cooper. Can you get him out of my room, please?
I'm at this sort of legal right now.
I'm calm.
What's your name?
Kimberly, I'm calm.
What was your last name?
Sellers, no, I'm calm. Listen, I'm calm.
Well, we have a supervisor coming up, so they're going to really try to help out.
Okay. Can you get Church out of my room?
Well, that's going to be a supervisor.
Now let's learn about the history of stealing brown babies in America. And what's really fun is that they didn't just steal the brown ones, they stole the white poor ones as well. So now let's go over why the CPS was created. Hopefully you will learn very quickly that I do not have time in every video essay to give every single citation. I'm really trying to communicate overarching abstract concepts and theories, but I will do my best to put links to as many things that I mention in these videos down below. And particularly for why the CPS was created, I would suggest an episode on a podcast called Behind the Bastards, and the episode is called America's War on Children. So fun fact, in the late 1960s, early 1970s, there were some studies done, and the US state was informed by these studies that there was rampant child abuse going on in many of the homes across America. It was very clear that the study concluded that the main source of the problem was poverty. Obviously, because we are also a racist country, this disproportionately affected families of color. What they found is that when people are suffering from capitalism and are living in poverty with the constant stresses of trying to feed your children, feed yourself, and put a roof over your head, they tend to develop negative expression for trauma that they are currently experiencing and probably trauma that they have experienced in their childhood. Because collectively we are all suffering from trauma. There's just different levels. So after the state was presented with this information, you know what they did? I mean, they solved poverty, of course. Duh, video over. Oh no, they didn't. Oh, they didn't do that. Okay, no, they didn't. Okay, well let me go back to my notes then. See. Oh, no. The state consciously decided not to deal with the problem. Yes, and to find a band-aid. Yeah, that's what they did. Sounds about right. One of the first band-aids for this problem was the Child Abuse Prevention and Treatment Act of 1974. This piece of legislation was particularly passed so the US state could distract the public from the actual findings of the study, which was that the poverty that the state is forcing them to be in is why they're abusing their children. And so they wanted to make sure that they looked like they were the kind people that they want us to think that they are. the US state, and they created a law that looked like they were helping all of these children, because the state is always going to find a solution to put the responsibility back on the individual so that you are not looking at the system or the structure or the state. The result of this in following years were that they started noticing that a lot of able-bodied working men were getting in trouble with the law for abusing their children. So instead of actually doing any research or looking at any scientific or medical study to see maybe a proper way to deal with this problem, they decided to change it so that abusive fathers only had to go to therapy with the abused wife or children so that they wouldn't have to miss work. Primary goal for the Child Abuse Prevention and Treatment Act of 1974 was to make a profit, to continue the genocide of brown communities, and to create a pipeline to our prison systems, also known as legal concentration camps. You might find it interesting. Even with the Child Abuse and Prevention Treatment Act of 1974, it was legal for teachers to spank children at school. In 1977, they decided to make a law to limit the intensity of the spankings and to a max number of 5 swats. And just in case you didn't know, it has been widely proven at this point by many different pediatricians and studies that spankings are child abuse and do affect the mental development of children.
But tonight, I'm talking about those children removed from their homes intentionally for profit. Children are seized unnecessarily from their families due to the federal aid created in 1974 entitled the Adoption and Safe Families Act. It offers financial incentives to the states that increase adoption numbers. To receive the adoption incentives or bonuses, local CPS must have more children. They must have more merchandise to sell. Funding is available when a child is placed in a foster home with strangers or placed in a mental health facility and medicated, usually against the parents' wishes. Parents are victimized by the system that makes a profit for holding children longer and bonuses for not returning children to their parents.
So even from the inception in 1974, we clearly see, and it has been whistleblown, that the purpose of CPS and the entire structure was for profit. CPS has a saying called the psychologically poor, and they will use this as an excuse to remove children from the home by saying it is in the children's best interest. 6 times more children die in foster care homes than in other home environments, and this is a $40 billion a year business.
Remove, abolish the federal and state financial incentives, and those are taxpayer dollars. Those dollars have turned CPS into a business that takes children and separates families.
Major bag alert, major bag alert, bag alert, major bag.
For money. Open family court. Remove the confidentiality laws. Give parents their rights verbally and in writing. I even feel that to terminate the rights of parents, the case should be heard before a jury.
The fact that the US state can terminate parental rights with just one investigator or one judge signing off on something is not freedom or liberty or justice for anyone. About 4 years after the CAPTA, Child Abuse Prevention and Treatment Act of 1974 was passed, in 1979, the courts ruled that minors can be taken away from their parents and put in state institutions with little to no due process. This was particularly used for minors who had disabilities. In 1984, the Supreme Court rules on Shaw v. Martin, which ruled that kids have a lesser inherent interest in liberty than adults do. a lesser inherent interest in liberty. So liberty is supposed to mean freedom, right? Freedom, liberty, we kind of use them interchangeably. But like, I want you guys to remember that we're always being gaslit. So when the state says liberty and freedom, they absolutely do not mean liberty and freedom. So what this ruling basically said was that kids don't like it when we authoritarianly try to program them into our system. So we're going to put them in jail, or at least in institutions. This court ruling also sets the standard that kids living in state-ran institutions are getting the same kind of care and is the same type of environment as kids being raised with their parents in their home. So they made it legal, the concept that solitary confinement in a state-ran institution is the same as having your own room in a loving home. So since kids don't have the same interest in liberty, they shouldn't have the same basic human right to have liberty. That's basically what this court ruling decided. So that means that those kids don't deserve the same amount of rights or proper representation or the freedom and ability to have due process. So basically, since kids aren't interested in freedom, they do not deserve the basic human right of freedom. And so whatever we do to them as the US state is okay. Over the next couple of years, these tactics led to over 70% of the low-income kids that were taken away from their parents or had slight behavioral issues being coerced by a state representative into waiving their rights to attorney and actually representing themselves in court. You know, because like 5 and 8-year-olds are like really good lawyers. Now remember, in the law of CAPTA, it clearly states that the goals are to increase reporting, investigations, and identification of child maltreatment and abuse with the general goal of keeping children safe, you know, by letting them represent themselves in the court of law. Another fun fact is that in the 1970s and 80s, the child court systems, like all the judges and administrators that worked for them, had incredibly negative biases towards the kids that they were working with. They discounted these kids because they were brown, or because they were poor, or because they thought they were criminals. And also sometimes because they thought they were just, like, abuse victims. So just threw them out, I guess. Not only did they disregard, like, the child's right to have proper representation, they oftentimes disregarded most of the parents' rights or ability to be represented properly as well. It was particularly cruel the way the courts went out of their way with lies and fraudulent documentation that stated that children had waived their right to counsel when the children didn't understand what was even going on, nor were they even properly asked. Children from the poorest families were absolutely never given counsel, and one way that the state would do this was by making the qualifications for getting counsel for free so low that nobody would meet them. At one point, it was like if you had $5, then you had too much money to be offered free counsel. Oh, honey. This law has been through some evolutions, okay? Some evolutions. Come with me, let's go, okay? So, here's a quick rundown of all of the legislative history of the Child Abuse Prevention and Treatment Act of 1974. Strap in, guys. The law was completely rewritten in the Child Abuse Prevention Adoption Family Services Act of 1988. It was further amended by the Child Abuse Prevention Challenge Grants Reauthorization Act in 1989. The Community-Based Drug Abuse and Neglect Prevention Grants was a program that was originally authorized by Sections 402 to 409 of the Continuing Appropriations Act for fiscal year 1985. The Child Abuse Prevention Challenge Grants Reauthorization Act of 1989 transferred the program to the Child Abuse Prevention and Treatment Act as amended. A new Title III, Certain Preventative Services Regarding Children of Homeless Families or Families at Risk of Homelessness, was added to the Child Abuse and Neglect and Treatment Act by the Stuart B. McKinney Homeless Assistance Act Amendments of 1980. The Child Abuse Prevention and Treatment Act was amended and reauthorized by the Child Abuse Domestic Violence Adoption and Family Services Act of 1992 and amended by the Juvenile Justice and Delinquency Prevention Act Amendments of 1992. The act was amended by the Older American Act Technical Amendments of 1993 and the Human Services Amendments of 1994. CAPTA was further amended by the Child Abuse Prevention and Treatment Act Amendments of 1996, which amended Title I, replaced the Title II Community-Based Family Resources Center program with a new Community-Based Family Resource and Support program, and repealed Title III. CAPTA was most recently amended by the Keeping Children and Families Safe Act of 2003, which amended Title I and replaced Title II Community-Based Family Resource and Support program with community-based grants for the prevention of child abuse and neglect. CAPTA was reauthorized in 2010 as the Child Abuse Prevention and Treatment Act of 2011. One of the ways that the U.S. state is able to continue to run abusive structures and programs like CPS is because the legislation, administration, and basically how the organization works is so convoluted and complicated that most of us everyday citizens either don't have time or do not have the energy to actually understand what the program or agency is actually doing. And most of these updates to the law were adjustments so that the for-profit side of the adoption and child protective services industry can make more money.
Take the baby, okay?
Your name is what?
Officer Howard.
Howard and Palma, and you are?
Carrillo, Investigator Carrillo.
To take her from me.
If I want it on camera. You taking my child from me?
Okay, I'm gonna place her in here. Or would you prefer?
You are wrong. Ma'am, you are wrong. You know that man attacked me. He shot me. You should be ashamed of yourself. All of you should be ashamed of yourself. You especially, y'all.
I'm gonna leave you my business card with my name and badge number on it, okay?
They should be ashamed of themselves.
CAPTA is the main policy that relates and works on solving the issue of child abuse and neglect. As for its effectiveness, at the 40th anniversary of the Child Abuse Prevention and Treatment Act, a report was written by the EU.'s Department of Health and Human Services. This report entails the description of all the benefits and progress that America has seen in protecting children from abuse and neglect since the CAPTA was enacted. Specifically, the report describes how the Act, CAPTA, started by responding to primarily the occurrence and effects of child maltreatment, but evolved to focusing on risk, prevention, and protection. There's two main reasons for creating different systems and structures that steal children away from families in America. Brown children are stolen from their parents, particularly to continue the white hegemony of this country. They are taken out of their culture, which renders them incapable of passing on traditions or being passed on traditions and culture, and oftentimes this pushes them towards white romantic partners, which then continues to not pass down their culture. This was done most effectively with indigenous cultures in the United States and in Canada, with boarding schools ran by Catholic churches.
This was combined with the abduction of Indian children from reservations to government-funded boarding schools, where they would be taught in the American way, punished for practicing their own culture or language, and thus forcibly assimilated. Such schools had always existed, but now that Indians had been nearly entirely concentrated under US government control, it was simpler for such a policy to be carried out far more aggressively than ever before. Depriving Indian children of their culture was seen as a way to solve the Indian question once and for all, as without generational transmission, it was believed that it would quickly disappear. Together with the aforementioned privatization of Indian lands, the idea was that both Indianness itself and any distinction between Indian and non-Indian land would no longer exist. These initiatives were a full-blown attack on the continued existence of distinct Native American peoples. The idea of a much reduced Indian population living independently and continuing their own way of life, even on heavily reduced areas of land under the strict control of the government, was still seen as intolerable by white society. It was not until 1934, when the government of Franklin D. Roosevelt granted Indians much greater sovereignty over their by then much smaller reservations, that the policy of direct government control and forced assimilation was finally ended, and Indians were finally at least left to continue their traditional ways if they so choose, though not completely by any respect, I must clarify.
The court mediator failed to follow the local rules and the law. She broke every single rule in the book. She doesn't read the file, she doesn't read the pleading, she doesn't know what the history of,
I would say we're seeing an emergency here. These children are being damaged. They're treating like throwaway kids. They're disposable. Their welfare is disregarded.
Who you know and how much money you have.
It doesn't have anything to do with the law. It doesn't have anything to do with justice.
Financial incentives are to keep these situations going. There's no financial incentive to settle the case. The evaluators make a ton of money. The attorneys for the minor and the family court attorneys are guaranteed payment for, if the child's 3 years old, for the next 15 years. Because they never settle these cases.
The child is placed in unsupervised visitation or full custody with the person that they've identified as the perpetrator of abuse. You know instantly that their protective parent is never going to just walk away and stop fighting for their in the family. They'll appoint an evaluator. And first it will go to court mediation. If there's enough money, they'll recommend private mediation. Typically, they'll appoint a parenting coordinator, a parenting coach, a therapist for each family member. And the amounts that these people can charge are not regulated at all.
So the only way that they're gaining this kind of power is due to the fact that within the United States, we have a culture of fear. It's the stranger danger generation we live in it right now. To the point where 68% of Americans believe that there should be a law that prohibits children aged 9 and under from being allowed to play unsupervised at a park. Right? 43% of those polled felt the same way about 12-year-olds. Essentially, these individuals choose to believe that by taking parents out of a household, throwing them into a cage where they can get raped and beaten, tossing those kids into foster homes where they'll be raped and beaten is better off than them playing in a park.
This is part of fear-mongering and the manufacturing of consent. They make the systems and structures so complicated and so opaque that you don't know how they work, and as long as they don't interconnect in your life, you kind of don't care. And then they can gaslight you into what they actually want you to believe that structure, agency, or organization is doing.
A specific term known as Parens patriae. And this was all kind of part and parcel with the mechanisms of action that led to Child Protective Services. So in order to understand CPS, you got to kind of understand its history. And its history lies in a specific term known as Parens patriae, which is Latin for parent of the nation, which should be exactly as creepy as that sentence. Essentially, it gives the government the mandate to take care of those who are considered unfit, which includes minors and those who are considered savages. Now, public school is obviously offshoot of this, and this was occurring in the early 1900s, anywhere from the about 1850s to 1910 when this was starting up. Essentially, there was a boom in the population that was scaring white aristocrats because they were no longer in control. Very specific white, by the way. That didn't include Irish people who were considered white at the time. Their words, not mine. So what stemmed from this was something called progressivism. Progressivism is regressivism. It's the scientific management by corporate interests to deal with those who were considered unfit savages due to the booming population. This included black individuals, Irish people, Native Americans, and Jews in specific cases. There was actually a...
So the concept of parent of the nation is disturbing. Although I definitely believe in more anarchist, collectivist, child-rearing environments, I definitely don't think that the U.S. state is a good mechanism for judgment on how children should be raised, just given historically what our government has been up to the last 250 years.
We brought up here, of course, that these individuals in their own minds had the best of intentions. And one of the ways they saw fit to remedy the issue to move it forward as quickly as possible was through forcible sterilizations. So in Native American populations, they set up things like reservations, right? So they would take artificially created tribes and then move them to areas like, I don't know, Oklahoma, where a lot of agriculture production is actually quite difficult. Then they would prevent any kind of competition between tribes or real competition or capitalism within their own tribes to make it so that essentially they had to rely on the government for everything that they needed. This was in order to whiteize them, essentially, to make them more like white people. And social workers took an invested interest in this, whereby they would go to some of these reservations. They would see when a child was living in a home where it wasn't just two parents, there's grandmothers, something along those lines. That was against the nuclear parent ethic, and they would restrict the woman's food supply the mother's food supply, if she would not volunteer to be sterilized. Now, this also occurred in North Carolina ghettos and a lot of black communities as well. A lot of the welfare actions were about conservatism. It was about regressing, preventing any kind of boom occurring in these minority neighborhoods, because God knows, can't have that.
Yes, let's just let that sit in for a second. The U.S. state would restrict an indigenous mother's food supply if she didn't agree to being sterilized. That's called genocide, people.
And I decided, this is the time to do this. So I sent an application and I was let in. Now, when it comes to a Child Protective Services investigator, the amount of responsibility that is given to these people is amazing. They have to be able to interview individuals. They have to have our understanding of child development, forensics, because you got to be able to tell if a bruise came from a punch or if they just fell down. You have to have an understanding of psychology, because you got to be able to dictate if someone is lying to you or not. You have to understand dispute resolution. God knows, when a gun got pulled on me, I didn't exactly have the best tact of dealing with a particular situation. And to do all this, to get all this cumulative data, well, to get, say, a degree in feminist studies and get a master's in it, then can take you 6 years. And I think there's a little bit less amount of information you actually need to know for that particular subject. But for this subject, we got 2 months of training.
I think that's less than police officers, actually, which is impressive. But 2 months to be qualified in all of those things and know if a parent is fit in a couple hour visits over the course of a few months, that's insanity.
Speak to the child. You try to talk to the kid before the parent even knows it's coming. There's rationales for it, but I still think it's kind of evil. Now, I would go to a public school, generally during the school year, to be able to ask these kids. So I'd go ahead and knock at the door, the administration would let me in, because we have a nice little bond relationship with public school teachers, and then I get to ask this kid a bunch of different questions regarding the allegations of abuse. Now, I don't know if many of you know much about sales, but essentially in order to be able to make a good sale, the person has to trust you. So you have to build a rapport. Building a rapport with a 4-year-old can be a little bit difficult, because their understanding of critical analysis is a little bit hard.
So, just to clarify, CPS investigators, who are a majority women, but there are men, are allowed to, without the parents' or child's consent, come to your child's school and question them about explicit sexual child abuse or abusive behavior. Does that seem right? Does that seem right? Does that seem right? I know some people will probably say, well, how else are you going to help the children that actually need help? Well, I think that we could figure out, I think maybe we could do some studies and figure out maybe a less consent violating, traumatizing way to do that. Because if that child hasn't suffered any abuse, well, now you've just abused them. Here's a couple more fun facts. Okay. So in our country, the lowest income class has the highest percent of abuse. This is because of stuff that we talked about earlier, capitalism, poverty. And children who are actually sent through the foster care system are 7 times more likely to suffer abuse in the foster care system than they would if they just stayed in their low income families. 7 times more. 7 times? 7 times. So you're telling me that kids are actually safer staying with their parents, even if their parents are maybe struggling or addicts? Yes, they are 7 times more likely to get abused in the CPS system. Kids that suffer the CPS system in our country are more likely to get PTSD than veterans of war. They're more likely to get PTSD, and they're also less likely to recover. And we'll talk a little bit more about that in a later section. So as I've been doing research for this video, I have come to the realization that CPS and all of the systems and structures which we have to still children, whether they be children of color or just children of poor white people, it's just one of the first steps in the pipeline to our prison system. aka legal concentration camps. And I keep calling them legal concentration camps because we're going to get onto a video essay on that in the future. I've literally already written most of the script, but I had to deal with white women and white mothers first. I really had to, sorry. So what I'm finding in my research is that the likelihood of you getting put into the justice system as an adult and even as a child when you go through Child Protective Services or when you are stolen, kidnapped from your parents, there's just got to be a connection. There's got to be a connection there. And there is. If you noticed earlier, I mentioned something about adoptable children. And if you're not an adoptable child, if you also don't have disabilities, because for some reason kids with disabilities actually make more profit for the state. It's this weird thing. Certain disabilities, not all disabilities. You know, we've got to have a privileged hierarchical system, even for people with disabilities. It's just American. So the non-adoptable children, they still need to make money off somehow. So by sending them through CPS, by sending them to multiple abusive homes, they can almost guarantee that they're going to end up in the prison system. And then in the prison system, they can be exploited at slave wages for their labor. And that's when they're really the most profitable for the state. It's legal kidnapping is what it is. It's legal kidnapping that we have been gaslighted to believe is perfectly normal human behavior, and it's not. It's incredibly sick and inhumane and uncivilized. Dare I say savage. I have an entire series that I'm going to dive into about all of the programming within our country and capitalistic structures. There's too many nuances and too many topics, so we're just going to do a series, so pay attention. That'll be coming soon in the future. And I have time. I'm gonna need a video editor. I also need an assistant. Is this an ad? I don't know. Is this an ad? This may be an ad. If you have time to volunteer to get on this train, once it makes some money, I got you. Okay? Okay, that was totally random. Let's get back to the topic. I brought an assistant to help me tell this story. So, I had an ex-boyfriend whose mother worked for CPS, and I had some interesting experiences with them, but one in particular stood out. Her main job was actually removing children from the home. And after about 6 months into this relationship, we went to go visit his family, and on that trip, he revealed to me that his mother was incredibly abusive and that he used to be a heroin addict. And his mother was abusive to all of her children, including his younger brother and younger sister. And it wasn't just physical abuse, it was kind of like sadistic, psychotic abuse, like having a full kitchen full of food, but then not feeding your children or not letting them eat. She used to lock them in closets when they would get home from school. By the way, this is after spending the day removing children from the home because they are being abused. So this white woman, 5 days a week, took kids out of brown people's home and other poor white people's homes, and then went home and sadistically, brutally abused her own children. I mean, when you think about it, like, it's kind of brilliant if you're an abuser, because, like, who are they gonna call? CPS? When we went to go visit him for that holiday, I remember someone making a joke about being abused. I think it was his younger brother made a joke about being abused, and everyone in the family started laughing after his mother said, well, he was the least abused out of all of you. It was the most awkward situation, I think, that I have ever been in, because everyone was chuckling and laughing, and I was like, does nobody else see Oh, absolutely fucked up this entire situation and just me? Okay. Needless to say, it didn't work out. No.
When I say the word medical kidnap, what I mean is children who are taken from their families for medical kinds of reasons, medical connections to the reason they're taken from their families, and generally by Child Protective Services. And I had no idea that human trafficking was connected. I learned that the majority of the children that are rescued from human trafficking come out of foster care. Foster care is a pipeline to human trafficking and child sex trafficking. According to the federal AFCARS report by the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services, less than 16% of children who are taken from their families are taken for any kind of reasons of abuse. Now, we think of Child Protective Services as designed to protect children from abuse, from child abuse. Child Protective Services only got involved if there were terrible parents who were abusing their children. That's what I thought it was for, and I think that is what the majority of Americans think that Child Protective Services is for. Less than 16% are taken for reasons of any kind of abuse. And these children are being taken from parents who have done no wrong. Sometimes children have been taken for because their parents want a second medical opinion. That children who are wards of the state, children in the system, can legally be used as medical lab rats for medical drug testing, drug pharmaceutical research, medical research without their parents' knowledge or consent. Well, you say, how can that be? Because the Nuremberg Code after the Holocaust told us that there has to be informed consent. Well, they bypassed that by having social workers or judges sign off on consent in place of the family. So children are literally being taken for medical research. Children that are in foster care are much more likely to be given psychotropic drugs, medications. Even babies 2 and 3 years old are sometimes given cocktails of lots of medications, psychotropic medications. We know that they've been directly involved in human trafficking, child sex trafficking. We've seen where children have been placed with child sex offenders. In fact, in Los Angeles, it was in the mainstream media a few years ago, there was a list of approved foster parents and another list of registered sex offenders. There were 1,000 names that were on both lists. Registered sex offenders who were approved, state-approved foster parents. One of the things that I hear so much is that, well, why aren't I know these people who are truly abusive. They really are abusive, and Child Protective Services doesn't do anything about it. And here's what I've learned from whistleblowers, from social workers who have talked to us and told us what's really going on. Because of financial incentives from the federal government on the federal level, like the Adoption and Safe Families Act in 1997 and other federal streams of money, what they're looking for are children who are considered to be adoptable. Children who are truly abused and truly in need of intervention are considered by the system to be damaged goods who are unadoptable. The federal incentives are creating an atmosphere where children can be taken from innocent families without having done anything wrong. And they can be put into the hands of pedophiles, traffickers, or people who want to use them for medical drug research.
Terry LaPointe is a former investigative journalist from Medical Kidnapping, testifies on how Children's Protective Services fails families and becomes the gateway for children to become victims of human trafficking. In Mrs. LaPointe's investigation, she briefly mentions that the agency often victimizes innocent families and fails to protect those who could benefit from their supposed protective nature. Why? Because federal funding incentives, particularly as found in the Safe Families and Adoption Act of 1977, reward agencies to take adoptable children from perfectly good families. Basically, this woman exposed that if you have enough money and you are a white family, you can absolutely order a child. This is not something that is unique to a couple of specific cases. This is a systematic countrywide problem. This also means that someone can basically say, I would like my neighbor's child. And then they can call CPS and file a false report, and then they can adopt that child. Oftentimes people think that this type of behavior happens most when there are custody battles, but people would be very, very surprised at how often CPS is threatened casually at people and how often it does get called and people lose custody of their children in perfectly healthy households. because it isn't just a threat that is used against the parents of the children. It's a threat that your neighbor can use, that your mother-in-law can use, that your aunt can use, that your teachers of your kids can use, just anyone who doesn't like you, pretty much. Many agencies have reported that over 60% up to 88% of all children recovered from human trafficking have been through the foster care system. Placed there by Child Protective Services, which has, for all intended purposes, illegally kidnapped these children from good families. Ms. Lupon's report continued to say, as almost anyone who has any contact with Child Protective Services knows, there is a huge difference between the beneficial public image the agency tries to maintain and the destructive, abusive, and neglected reality of their practices. She continued, it is completely irresponsible for our government officials to keep asserting that all we need is allocation of more money to CPS to keep our children safe, when at least 60% of the children that have been rescued from human trafficking are being filtered through these systems. Some history about human trafficking and Child Protective Services. In 1984, the United States Congress established the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children, called the NCMEC, and as part of the Missing Children's Assistance Reauthorization Act of 2013, they received $40 million to study and track missing and trafficked children in the United States. In 2017, the NCMEC assisted law enforcement with over 27,000 cases of missing children, the majority who were considered endangered runaways. According to their most recent report compiled by FBI data and their own studies of the nearly 25,000 runaways reported to the NCMEC in 2017, 1 in 7 were likely victims of sex trafficking. And of those sex trafficking victims, 88% were in the care of social services when they went missing. Equally as disturbing as the fact that most sex trafficked kids come from within the system is the fact that the FBI discovered in a 2014 nationwide raid that many foster children rescued from sex traffickers, including children as young as 11, were never reported missing by the child welfare authorities. So that means like the state knew they were missing and were just like, oh well. And these trends have been corroborated by other governmental agencies. Just some other really fun facts. In 2012, Connecticut police rescued 88 children from sex trafficking. 86 were from the child welfare system. In 2013, the FBI did a 70-city nationwide raid. 60% of the victims came from foster care or group homes. In 2014, New York authorities estimated that 85% of sex trafficking victims were previously in the child welfare system. And this one's one of my favorites. It kind of almost broke me while I was writing this script. But 90% of youth that are in foster care, if they go to 5 or more placement homes, it is a 90% chance that they will enter the justice system. 90%. See, the main reason that nothing is really done about the sex trafficking is because it really only affects brown children and poor children. We can't actually even know the amount of children that might have been sex trafficked in America, and part of the reasons why we can't know those numbers is because of the prohibition of sex work within our country. Keeping sex work illegal within America creates an environment in which consenting sex workers cannot admit to state agencies that they are consenting adult sex workers for fear of legal ramifications. populations. Without the numbers of actual consensual adults doing sex work, you cannot accurately calculate the percentages of children or adults being sex trafficked versus consensual sex workers. So we don't actually know the numbers, and there's no way to know those numbers. Because of the prohibition of sex work and that phenomenon of not being able to actually know accurate numbers of people who are being sex trafficked in our country, that works in the favor of the sex traffickers and hinders our ability to be able to rescue people who are actually being human trafficked or sex trafficked. These policies stay in place because the bourgeoisie, the elite, the powerful do not give a fuck about you or your children. The only thing that this class of citizens in our country cares about is how you and your children can be a profit for their corporation. The children of poor white people and brown people in this country are meant to be the bourgeoisie's and the elite's playthings. And this doesn't just include the lowest class of white people, this also includes middle class white people, because if you look at the institutions in which perpetuate child abuse, they look like the Catholic Church, Boy Scouts, any sort of kids organized sports. Jeffrey Epstein. Although children in American households are a beautiful joy for those households, what they are to the state are three things. They are mini laborers to be exploited, who need to be sorted out between who is a master and will give orders, who is a submissive and will take orders, who are the enforcers, and who become the product. Your children are valuable to the system for three reasons. You are either training them to become enforcers of the system, masters, to becoming submissives to the system, slaves, or to become an outlier, the product. It's kind of like a plantation, you know? Master, slave, except the humans are the cotton.
I want to clear this up right now, so you can continue to use this video to go back to reference. Rachel Dolezal stole that term from the adoptee community. Transracial does not mean what Rachel Dolezal made it to mean at all. And what she did was an incredible disservice to the adoptee community and incredibly violent to Black people. Transracial means a transracial adoption, meaning that the child who is adopted was adopted by parents of a different race. What Rachel Dolezal did was delegitimizing to so many people, including mixed people, it's not even funny. So I hope I never see that name in my comments again.
And I think to myself,
So if you haven't heard this story, long story short, this is a story about a white lady who lives in Vermont who adopted a Black child who has many mental health issues. He's 14 years old. He ended up stealing some stuff from the store, and she decided to call the police. And this whole thing is a story because she was shocked that, quote, they treated him like an animal. Of course, you dumb bitch. He's Black. It's America. It's Vermont, where there are no Black people, and they're just inherently more fucking racist up there. White people, what is y'all's obsession with calling the police on people to teach them a lesson? Do you realize that when you have Black kids, that lesson is going to be you burying your child in a fucking grave? Is that the lesson that you want? Furthermore, it's just straight up lazy parenting. Instead of having a conversation with your child, instead of doing the extra work that you need to do when you have a child who's not only Black, but also is queer and has many mental health issues, instead of taking the time to actually have the conversations and do the work, you decided that calling the police would be the best way to teach a lesson.
Re-recording. Fucking my episode on. And because the universe wants me to go through this story again, so I keep on. So from the time I was like 17, I never wanted children. Kids. Didn't want them. Fortunately, when I was 19, I found myself pregnant. Maybe a result of all of that sexual repression and lack of sexual education growing up. I literally had to go to the library during sex ed classes in high school and take abstinence courses by myself out of a book. So when I got pregnant, I was still deeply rooted in my evangelical cult-like childhood religion, and so abortion was not an option. I spent 7 months of my pregnancy, absolutely planning on becoming a mother, even though it never really like set in or like felt right. I was kind of just doing what people around me wanted me to do, and a lot of the people around me were just like super excited to have like a half Puerto Rican, half me child being cute and adorable around the community. It was like a lot of fetishization, featureism. When I had mentioned adoption, it was absolutely shamed, which I thought was odd in my community because I was still under the impression that my birth mother had consensually given me up for adoption, and she was like really against me giving my daughter up for adoption, but then also didn't explain why or give any context. I was told that it would have been better if I had an abortion. I was told that I absolutely didn't love this child because I was considering giving her up for adoption. About 2 weeks before my due date, after a shit ton of contemplating, I kind of went behind my birth mother's back and reached out to a private adoption agency. I was not ready to become a mother, and I had been raised in a household that definitely emphasized the need for resources and capital to be able to raise children, and I did not have those. So for 2 weeks, I kind of snuck around and organized everything with the adoption agency. I picked 2 families. Yes, they were white families. Those were my only options. One of the families didn't want to adopt because she was going to be Black, and I was prepared for that. I was very aware of transracial adoption and the intersections and difficulties there, even though I was maybe not aware of all of the larger societal implications of race. So I ended up picking a family that I knew was going to provide her with material resources and a good education, and I was trying to pick a family where the mother was an academic or intellectual because I felt like that was something I missed out on growing up because my mother was a housewife. About 2 days before my due date, I let everyone in my group know that I had already planned on giving my daughter up for adoption, and they were mad. My birth mom didn't speak to me for like 6 weeks. My adopted mom was like the only one who was really staying in contact with me. My half-sister didn't speak to me. They were really upset. But it was my decision. Yeah, if I could go back with the knowledge I have now, I would make different decisions. So would most people. But with what I knew then, I think I made the best decision I could. And all I can do now is hope that in a couple years, when my daughter is going to be 18, that she can understand and that she wants to meet me and that I picked the least harmful white parents. I actually can't wait for that day to meet my daughter. It is very much something I have compartmentalized so that I can focus on, I'm going to be honest, making my life worth something so that when she does find me, I didn't waste it. That may be fucked up, I don't know, but that's the truth. And I've had to film this segment twice, and I think now I know why. Making this series has been very much a healing process, and I hope it will be helpful to others. I hope it gets viewed, but if it doesn't, it's still worth the journey because my heart is broke and healed and broken and healed and is still healing, but there's hope. Okay, I'm ending this clip because I'm not crying in this video essay, okay? I've put enough goddamn fucking energy into this thing. I'm not fucking crying, okay? I'm done. So I really wanted to cover the creation of CPS, adoption, Planned Parenthood, Indigenous child residence schools, and also white women and white men in interracial relationships within this segment. And then as I started going down the research channel, the research hole, there was way too much information. And so I definitely got into a deep dive on CPS, and now I'm going to send you to some other entertaining resources if you want to dive deeper in on the topics about adoption, Planned Parenthood, and Indigenous residential schools. And then since I was not raised by a white parent and a black parent, I was raised by two white adopted parents, I thought I would share with you what some other mixed kids had to say about their experiences in their households. The main resource that I'm going to give you is going to be Behind the Bastards. I'm going to mention it so many times because it's such a great resource, and I really trust Robert Evans, the host, who reads whole books and reports to do these essays for these podcasts, and then he brings on incredibly engaging guests that make the topics very entertaining, even though they are incredibly dark and depressing most of the time. So I do want to give you some teasers to maybe spark your interest in actually going and doing this extra bit of research. I know you guys like to get everything just in one video, but adoption and Planned Parenthood were definitely created by people who were eugenicists, and based on the science of eugenics, to different varying degrees, given that back in that historical time, eugenics was unfortunately an acceptable science. And if you haven't heard about the Indigenous residential schools in Canada, there's been news going on about it over the last year. I've been thinking it's very interesting that the news stories keep coming from Canada, because Canada got that practice tool, that tactic from us. They got it from America, which means we got mass graves as well. Yeah, we just haven't cared. It's very likely that I will do a video essay on these topics, specifically diving in deeper in the future, because mixing my own life experience with this amount of research has definitely opened up to some other dark corners on these topics that I would really like to cover. Like I previously mentioned in this video, my adopted brother is Indigenous Cherokee, and Indigenous rights have always been very, very near and dear to my soul. I also want to add on here, if I hadn't previously mentioned it, maybe I have, I don't know. I've also given a daughter up for adoption. I had a daughter when I was 20. I did give her up to white parents, but I was 20 and I didn't know shit, and that's one of the reasons why I'm making this video. Sorry, might have just triggered myself. Because my daughter's gonna be 18 in a few years, and so I'm supposed to have it together by then. Y'all let me know if I have it together, okay? Okay, just think that it's important that I'm transparent about my own life experience so you can understand the mindset and perspective that I am coming from. Okay, quick list Behind the Bastards episodes that you absolutely need to listen to. America's War on Children. All fertility doctors are bastards. How the Catholic Church murdered Ireland's babies. What the Catholic Church did in Ireland is also kind of what we did here to single mothers. Canada's dark secret, residential schools, the women who invented adoption by stealing thousands of babies, Robert Baden-Powell, the founder of the Boy Scouts, the company that poisoned 300,000 babies, Elon School, the worst troubled teen facility. Definitely going to be talking about that in future episodes of video essays. How Nestle starved a bunch of babies, Kellogg, the great American cum doctor. Kellogg can go right up there with Kissinger. He didn't kill as many people, but he killed maybe the same amount of souls and sex drives. The White Savior, fake doctor who may have killed 100 babies, and the Judge Rodenberg Center, which is about horrible torture and just torture and sometimes murder that the state allowed institutions to do to kids with autism. Okay. Listen to these mixed black people's experiences. I gotta like take an emotion break. Feel free to pause this and take an emotional break. You don't have to watch this whole thing in one take. It's a lot.
It's a lot.
Let's talk about this because a couple men commented this on my post, and I want to explain to y'all how it is different. So when we as Black people see other Black people with partners that are white, the reason why we may look badly on that is because of assumptions that are correlated to our experience with oppression and how we deal with that. So when we see a white woman with a Black man, our assumptions about that Black man is that he does not like Black women. That he is the type, and you know what type I'm talking about, that praises white women while degrading Black women. So Black women will have a bad view of him based on this assumption. And when we talk about this assumption, more times than not, it is true. Now let's go to a Black woman with a white man. The assumptions that I see Black men having about this scenario are very different. They think the white man is running her. They think it's because she hates Black men and that she's a traitor to her race. This assumption, more times than not, is not true. I want you to talk to some Black women that are with white men. I'm telling you right now, more than likely she runs that man. And I mean like in a good way. Because Black women have been forced into masculine roles, we often seek out partners or men who are more feminine. So there is little truth in the shaming of a Black woman with a white man, based on the idea that he is running her. Taking it back to the assumption that she just doesn't like Black men, if you are looking for someone to take on a more feminine role, it is going to be much harder finding that with men of color. Because men of color are struggling to feel even validated in their masculinity, much less their femininity. So they are often not wanting to take on that role. White men are validated in their masculinity from the time that they grow up, so they are not going to feel like taking on a feminine role makes them less of a man in the same way. Then let's take it to the assumption that she is a traitor to her race. Being with a white man does not separate a Black woman from her Blackness, from her community, from her beliefs, anything like that, in the way that Black men think it does. Think about mixed children. People always say that mixed children with Black mothers are always much more comfortable in their Blackness and interacting with Black people than mixed children with Black fathers. That is because the Black woman is not a traitor to her race when she gets with a white man, in the same ways that a Black man who is with a white woman is. And I'm saying based on his actions, not just based on the fact that he's with a white woman. And I'm also saying based on his partner. Ask people of color. We often have better experiences with white men who have a partner that is a person of color versus a white woman who does. And that is often because Black men dating white people are dating racists, but Black women dating white people are dating allies.
Mixed children who have white mothers tend to be more exposed to internalized racism and colorism because of the lack of intersectionality among white feminists.
People are like, yeah, children with white moms tend to be a little anti-Black. And I was like, shoot, I got a white mom. I will admit that there was some definite anti-Blackness like stuff when I lived with my white mom.
And my grandmother sees my brother's shirt and he's wearing a shirt that looks just like this with Malcolm X and the rifle. And my grandma is like, really? Malcolm X with a gun? So violent. This is a Facebook post from my uncle. You can pause to read if you want, but basically he was saying that he'll kill any Black Lives Matter or Antifa protester if defund the police were to actually be achieved. He knows that I'm very passionate about Black Lives Matter and have always been attending or organizing protests. So when he says stuff like that, he's directly threatening my life. You clearly don't know how race works because, no, I'm not half white. I'm racially 100% Black. Just like my mom has green eyes, but that doesn't mean I'm half green-eyed. My experience is Black. That's all I know. I won't be half denied a job. I won't be half murdered by the police. I am Black. That's it.
So many commenters were saying things like, oh, I didn't know my culture. I have a white mom and I didn't know my culture. Why would you expect a white woman to teach you about your black culture? Where was your black father? And the issue is misogynoir, where some black men, not all, but some black men are only with white women because of a closer proximity to whiteness, and they put down their own women and own culture as a result. Us mixed kids need to combat that misogynoir as well as the internalized racism.
Well, my mom was definitely like this before she had me, before they met. And she, like, the family was worse. Like, honestly, they had a nickname for my dad. It involved the N-word. That was really hard to find out.
You live in a predominantly white area in a country that's controlled by whiteness. The information that you receive about black people from society is all just stereotypes. This is what can cause them to begin to see their blackness in a negative light, because no one at home is mentioning their blackness and how it's powerful and beautiful. If you want your child to be proud of who they are, their blackness is a part of that. You can't just pick and choose parts of our identity that you want to accept and dismiss the other. That just further reinforces the idea that blackness is taboo and negative. Additionally, mixed people aren't superhuman. You didn't just create a new category of race by sleeping with a black man. Our blackness doesn't just disappear, it's still there. If you say that you don't feel the need to talk about color, then you're just saying that you want to remain ignorant. Not to just our experiences, but also the greatness in our black identity.